Good evening.
Good evening.
It's good to be back with you people tonight, and I've got some exciting stories to tell you. Let me tell you, we're getting into the good part now. Tonight, we've been talking all along about Jesus having disciples. Well, tonight we're going to talk about when he chose us as his 12 apostles. We've been following Jesus, most all of us. We were disciples like everybody else, and we were watching what Jesus had done. We watched him heal a lame man. We even heard Jesus when he claimed to be the Son of God, and it made the Pharisees mad. We saw Jesus witnessing when we wouldn't witness. We were watching. We were watchers, just watch what Jesus does. And he witnessed a lot. He talked about the Sabbath day a lot when we were sitting around with him or any other time. He even healed a man, we talked about last week, healed a man on the Sabbath day. He told everybody that he was God's servant. Even told them he was God's son. And the Pharisees said, blasphemy, you blaspheming God, claiming to be God's son or claiming to be God himself. But you know what Jesus had that was following us and following him? Crowds of people. I mean, crowds everywhere. You couldn't go anywhere without the crowds coming. They had seen Jesus do miracles. They had seen the things that Jesus was doing. The word got out, and when the word gets out, people start running to him. A lot of them were running just to be healed, the sick people. But one day, and I guess Mark tells it best, Jesus went up on a mountain. He wanted to be by himself to get away from the crowds. And they came anyway. Of course, we went with him also because we were part of the crowd at that particular time. Jesus wanted to be alone. He didn't want to be around us. And we were part of that crowd that was just going along, seeing what Jesus was going to do next. And then he sat down. And out of all those disciples that were following Jesus, he picked 12. 12 of us. He had already asked us to follow him, and that's what we were doing. We were following him. Now he called us and appointed us that he might send us out to preach. We've been learning. He's been teaching. Jesus did a whole lot of teaching. And now he's called us. Were we surprised? Yeah, I was surprised. Separate from everybody else, I want you to be my apostles. I want you to follow me everywhere I go. I want you to watch what I do, listen to what I say, and pay attention. Pay attention. Some people don't pay attention very well, but he wanted us to pay attention. Now, after he chose the 12 up on that mountain, he went up on that mountain, guess what he did next? And your preacher preached on it several Sundays ago. He preached. He didn't just teach that when he was up on that mountain. He preached. You call it the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount. And we're not going to go through it a lot other than some of the things that Jesus did. He talked about the Beatitudes. Your pastor preached on that. He talked about salt and light. He talked about the law. He talked about anger. He talked about adultery. He talked about divorce. He talked about teaching oaths, teaching about revenge, teaching about loving your enemies. Boy, that was a hard one. We're sitting there listening to Jesus preach, and he starts telling us we're supposed to love our enemies. It kind of set us all back a little bit, like, really? Just like if somebody asked you to do something that you knew you didn't want to do, your first word would be, really? And that's the way we felt. He's telling us we got to love our enemies. Rome was our big enemy. That was the Roman oppression was all over. They were just doing whatever they wanted to us as citizens. Because we weren't Roman citizens, and they were taking over. So when he said love your enemies, he not only told us to love our enemies, he told us how. He told us how to love our enemies. He talked about giving to the needy. He talked about praying and fasting, and we touched on that a little bit last week. He talked about your money, and he talked about our possessions that we had and how we should treat those. He told us not to condemn others. So this sermon went on and on about what to do, how to have effective prayer, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And what we thought that meant was exactly opposite, and he had explained it to us, what it really meant. And he also talked about heaven. He talked about how to get to heaven. He talked about a narrow gate, narrow. He talked about a wide gate that a whole lot of people would get through the wide gate and they choose that path. But he also talked about that narrow gate, that little gate. And he said only a few would pass through it. He talked about tree and its fruit. He used parables. And then he explained his parables. Some he did, some he didn't. He talked about what it took to be true disciples of Jesus. He talked about how we start, how we're supposed to build up on a solid foundation. You remember we talked about him being the cornerstone. We're part of the foundation. Even in the world you live in today, you're part of that foundation that's building God's church. We saw Jesus do many, many miracles. He talked about them during his Sermon on the Mount. And then after we left there, he kept doing what he was doing. We talked about Jesus talked to us, and we watched him about the Roman centurion and his son. And now, did you hear my words? I said Roman centurion, and he's coming to Jesus to help him and his son. And then he raised a widow's son. Now, a lot of people get confused on this. They think it was, when he says the widow's son, they think it was a little baby. No, it was her son. He was a man. If you read some of your scriptures in the Bible, it says her son, and then it calls him a man. And she was a widow. That means her husband had already died. Now she's lost her only son. I want you to put yourself where we were. Here is a coffin with a dead person in it. He's dead. And they're marching through town to funeral. It's an open coffin. It's the way they did. They didn't put a lid on until they got to the graveyard. But the coffin is open. And Jesus, seeing the agony and the pain that she was in through losing her son, walks up to her son and touches him and tells him to raise up. Well, everybody kind of do what? And this man come out of the coffin alive. Alive. True story. I saw it with my own eyes. You can't believe it because you didn't see it. We couldn't believe it and we saw it. A miracle. And boy, you're talking about them telling that story, and the crowds coming after Jesus after that and wanted to make him a king. He was special. And he had to leave. He had to leave. He talked about judgment for unbelievers. Yes, Jesus himself talked about what would happen to unbelievers. He talked about a prayer of thanksgiving. So many things that we watched Jesus do as we went along the way, and the whole time he was teaching. And we were listening, and getting scared part of the time with some of the things he was doing. Did we understand? No, but we watched. We couldn't understand how these things were going. Other than we said, this is the Messiah. This is the true Messiah. We think. Why do I say that? John the Baptist even was the forerunner of Christ. And he even sent word to Jesus when John the Baptist was in prison and wanted to know if he was the one or should they look another. And then Jesus went on to tell about healing the sick, raising the dead, and all the things that he had been doing. And he pretty well told John, don't look for anybody else. I'm the Messiah. Now, why would John even ask that question? Have you ever been in prison? Have you ever been in one of those smelly rooms and holes that they put you in prison where it's cold and it does things to your mind? And even the mind of John the Baptist became a question. It became a question. But Jesus comforted him just as he comforts anybody else that's got a problem or anything that they've got a question about. There's the answer. It seemed like when Jesus was back to the Sermon on the Mount, he covered about everything that happens in your life, and then explained it to you. He talked about the wheat and the tares. He talked about the hidden treasures. He used so many examples of things that we just consider everyday things. He would take something like a fishing net and he would put it out there, and then he would start explaining an illustration of the fishing net and what it caught and how we should, as disciples, catch people. He had told us before, I'm going to make you fishers of men. And now he's talking about a fishing net. And what does it do? It catches fish. And we're supposed to be like the illustration of that fishing net, and we're supposed to catch men. Yes, Jesus chose us. 6 of us were fishermen. We saw Jesus calm a storm one night. We were terrified. Jesus won't. He calmed the storm by just speaking to it. But let me tell you one even better than that. When Jesus, and I'm going to tell you, this is a good one. When the crowds got to him, Jesus went up to the mountain again to pray, and the crowds followed him all day long, and he's sitting there praying, and then he looks, and it's getting late, and this crowd's hungry. And there was about 5,000 men, not including their women and children. Jesus said, how are we going to feed them? What are we going to do to feed them? Well, it's going to take a whole lot of money. I didn't even speak then. I just sat back and I'm trying to think. The question is the same thing Jesus asked, how are we going to feed them? But he already knew how he was going to feed them. He was just asking, do you know how? What's it going to take, Philip? What's it going to take to feed these people? Guess who spoke up first? His first disciple that actually followed him, not his apostle, his first disciple was Andrew. And Andrew said, there's a little boy over here. Got 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He got what? 5 loaves and 2 fishes. We're looking out there, probably 15,000 people. How is Jesus going to feed 15,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish? So he said, y'all come here. Give me the fish. Give me the bread. And each one of you 12 take a basket. And I'm going to put fish and bread in that basket. And you're going to go around. I've got them all sitting down, and I want you to feed them. There again, you want us to what? How's it going to happen? He starts reaching in the basket that the boy had, and he filled my basket. He filled James's basket. He filled all of our baskets, and we went around giving everybody bread, and then we go back to Jesus. There'd be more in that bag. There'd be more in that bag. And he kept passing it out. It was like a never-ending supply. and we fed all of them. And we not only fed all of them, but we fed all of them everything they wanted till they were full. And then Jesus says, go back and pick up what's left over and put it into baskets. Guess how many baskets full were left? The same thing that we started with. There was 12 baskets full of leftovers. How would that make you feel? Some people would say fairy tale, just a fairy tale that's in the Bible. But let me tell you, it wasn't a fairy tale. I was there and I saw it with my own eyes. Let me tell you how we explain it. You can't explain Jesus. You can't explain God and God's power and what Jesus does. There's no explanation there other than he was who he said he was. He raised the dead. Now he's fed all these people. Here's what we do. He told us, I want you to watch, I want you to listen, and I want you to learn. But most of all, I want you to remember. Remember me. And remember what I say. So we just went along. Now, after that, the crowds got so bad. Word got out, the crowd got even bigger, so we got in a boat. Jesus says, I'm going back up on the mountain, and I'll meet y'all on the other side. So 12 of us got in a boat. 6 of us, like I said, were fishermen. We've been in storms before. But we get in the middle of the lake going to the other side, and the wind and the storm is so strong our boat won't go in anywhere. And we were scared. Yes, fishermen. Can you imagine the other 6 that weren't fishermen, how scared they were? And then we turn around and thunder and lightning and wind and rain, and we look and something's coming across the water, walking on top of the water, and we thought it was a ghost. Somebody said it's Jesus. Jesus walking on the water. And that's just part of the story. Guess who spoke up first? Good old Peter. Good old Peter. Jesus, if that's really you, ask me to come to you. And we all sitting there saying, Peter's lost his mind again. Peter don't know what he's saying. Peter's going to drown even though he's a fisherman. He wants to walk on the water. He wants to be like Jesus. Now that we look back, and I'm going to finish that story, but now that we look back, who don't want to be like Jesus? We all want to be like Jesus. Jesus wants us to follow him. He wants us to try to be like him. And here is Peter, the very first one that says, I'm getting out of this boat and I'm going to Jesus. Jesus, if that's really you, let me come to you. Jesus held his hand out and says, come on. And Peter gets out of the boat, and we're all sitting there looking, crazy, man. Peter, you're crazy. You're going under the water. And Peter starts walking on the water, going towards Jesus. He was looking right straight at Jesus. And when he was going to him, he had his eyes on him. Jesus had his eyes on Peter with his hand stuck out. And here's Peter. And then all of a sudden, Peter stops, and he looks down and he looks around. And as soon as he took his eyes off of Jesus, he went down, just like we told him he was going to do, but he had already done more than we thought he would do. He walked on water. Peter did. And Jesus is standing there, and Peter starts sinking, and Jesus reaches down and picks him up, pulls him out, and they get in the boat. And then immediately we're on the shore. That's another miracle that's usually left out of people telling stories. I was there. We were here in one instance, and the next instance, we're on the other side where we're supposed to be, just like that. 2 miracles in one. You want to call it 3? Jesus is walking on the water. That's a miracle. Number 2, Peter walked on the water. That was a miracle. And number 3, we end up on the other side, just like snapping your fingers. We went through a lot of storms with Jesus, and he always was so calm, smiled, calm and collected. That other storm that we had where we were going across and it was so bad, we'll tell you about it later, but that's another one where Jesus was so peaceful. Even as rough as it was, he was asleep. And we were scared to death again. We had to wake him up. But to be with Jesus and to see the things that he did, to see the storms that he calmed, and we did not understand until after he was already gone what all this really meant. Look back with me. Peter getting out, walking on the water with his eyes on Jesus. When he took his eyes off Jesus, he went down. What's the story for you today? The story for you today is when you got your eyes on Jesus, everything's going fine. You take your eyes off, things start happening. Keep your eyes on Jesus. He did so many things and did them calm, cool, and collected, as y'all saying goes. And a lot of things that we saw, you read. And so many of people in your world today read but don't believe. That couldn't have really happened. That didn't really happen. No way Peter walked on the water. No way Jesus walked on the water. No way he calmed a storm by just speaking to it. It's just a story in the Bible. Well, let me tell you, I saw every bit of it with my own eyes. It's all true. No fairy tales in the Bible. We wrote what God put on our hearts. Most of what we wrote, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and myself, we wrote what God told us to write, plus we saw it happen, me and Matthew. Now let's go back to Matthew a little bit. You know, a couple of weeks ago, he told Matthew to follow him too, and we didn't like Matthew. Well, guess what? Matthew's grown to be one of us. When he picked the 12, he picked Matthew too. We thought he was, when he wanted to pick those 12, Matthew, no way he's going to make it. He picked Matthew also. When he started teaching about love one another and all the love that was in Jesus' heart just melted out on us, we forgot what Matthew was. We weren't worried about what he was then. We were worried about what he is now. A lesson that carries from generation to generation to generation. We don't worry about what people were before they were saved. We just like what they do now. I heard a story this week. Yeah, I do hear stories just like y'all do. I get to talk to people just like y'all do. I still get to feel the presence of Jesus Christ in my heart. I still eat real food. Sometimes I eat fast food. McDonald's. I'm not advertising for McDonald's, but that just happened to be where I was at. When this man that I knew, but hadn't seen him in a while, comes up to me, said, I hadn't seen you in a while. I said, yeah, I know. I have things I have to do. I was sitting down, what I always do, reading, still read, still study. And he stood around and he acted like he wanted to talk to me, but I was busy. He went and sat at the table that I usually sit at. Well, God still speaks to me through Jesus. He said, go over there and talk to that man. He had something on his mind. So I go over and I sit down with him. He said, I sure am glad you came over here because I was just sitting here thinking, I really need to tell you something. I really need to tell you something. And I was thinking about going over talking to you. I said, well, the Lord put me over here first. He said, I had a dream. In the last days, old men will dream dreams. Young men have visions. This is an older man. He said, I had a dream. He said, I got a grandson that's got 1 foot in heaven and 1 foot in hell. He said he can't make up his mind. He don't want to give up his drugs, but he still wants to go to church. He said, and I had a dream that I need to tell you about. I said, well, tell me about your dream. He said, I woke up and I was looking at Jesus and he was walking towards me. He said, and I fell down right in front of him and I grabbed both of his ankles. And he told me to stand up. He said, when I stood up, he pointed in this direction. And when he pointed in this direction, there's a big movie screen. Y'all been to the movies, haven't you? Well, it was like a big movie screen. And it had the trails going up a mountain, the rocks, and we were going up the mountain. And when we got to the edge, it was a real big drop-off. There was a pile of white stuff over here. He said, this high. He said, and all of a sudden, a bulldozer came and pushed my grandson and that pile of white stuff over the cliff. He said, and then I woke up. He said, and I called my grandson and I talked to him because we've talked to him before. He said, I don't know what else to do. He said, because his side of the family hadn't talked to me in 2 weeks. He said, but I had that dream. And he's crying while he's telling me this story. He had me crying too. Yeah, John still cries. He said, my wife had a dream last night. She said, we were at the mountains and there was a patio. And when you got to the end of the patio, there's that big drop off again. And my grandson was there and he fell over and my wife grabbed him by the ankles and pulled him back up and told him, not long as I'm living, I would never give up on you. I told you that story. It's a true story too. I told you that story to tell you that's the way Jesus is. He never gives up on anybody. People give up on their own families. They'll go tell their family, and when they don't call them for 2 weeks or to talk to them because they've mentioned Jesus' name and they didn't want to hear about Jesus, they start having family feuds. But Jesus won't like that. Jesus didn't hold back anything. He told it. He told it the way it is. And it was always a true story and not a fairy tale. All these stories that you're listening to from now to Easter, because that's where I want to get to. I want to get to Easter in just a few days after Easter. The story gets even more real. It gets even more real and harder for non-believers to believe. But I've showed you things that Jesus did. It's all in your book. It's all in the Bible. Stories there. Matthew wrote them. Mark wrote them. Sometimes Matthew, just like the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew's the only one talked about the Sermon on the Mount until you get up to a certain place, and then you go into Luke 6 and you find out some things that Luke tried to tell about that part of the sermon. But Matthew tells the whole sermon. He didn't leave anything out. Common storms, winning people, teaching us, and that's what you need to do today. Go out and teach. You know it. All of you has been coming to church for a long time. You know the stories. Don't hold them to yourself. Do like Jesus did and share them. He taught us to share them. You know what we did before Jesus died on the cross? Just watched. We didn't really do anything until one day he sent us out 2 by 2. 12 of us, told us to go out. He gave us the power to cast out demons. He gave us the power to raise the dead. He gave us the power to heal the sick just like him. And we did some, not like we should. We did some. And we'll talk about that next week. There's so many things in his book to tell you. And I just get excited trying to tell people, especially people that don't understand why. They want to ask why. We did. We asked why. But guess what? When we asked why, we found out why. Because Jesus never left us hanging. He always explained it to us. And now we have the same opportunity to write it in a book and explain it to you. Some people just read part of the book and they don't read the explanation further down. They just read that and say, that didn't happen. There's no explanation for that. And you go down about 2 more verses and it's explained to you. It's the way Jesus worked. And he's still teaching today through not his apostles. He's teaching people through you. You've got an opportunity to go out and share Jesus, to share these stories that I'm sharing with you. And make sure people don't think they're fairy tales. They really happen. Tell them you heard it from John. And then open up his book and show them. And that's all for tonight. So I'll be back with you next Wednesday night. And we'll talk about some more things that Jesus did. It gets better as it goes. Any questions? Now, Brother Brian, would you dismiss us, please?
Dear Lord, Heavenly Father,